Ethnic and racial prejudice is a common occurrence in history, brought upon by power dynamics that emerge between different peoples. While not a natural human impulse, the development of ethnic and racial stereotypes often occurred due to political circumstances. Just like in our modern world, the ancient world certainly had its own views on ethnicity and race, which were at times very familiar to us and at times completely alien to the modern eye. In this series, we will discuss the conception of ethnicity and race in various ancient societies, such as Greece, Rome, and Egypt. We will do this by looking at art and texts from those societies and contextualizing historical events from their respective eras. In this first video, we will transport you to the ancient polis of Hellas and explore perceptions of race, identity, ethnicity, and racism in the world of ancient Greece. This video is sponsored by our YouTube members and patrons, who get 2 exclusive videos weekly, not available anywhere else, for their kind support of our channel. You can join their ranks to watch more than 160 videos, including our series on the Pacific War, Punic Wars, Persian Wars, Spanish War of Succession, Russo-Japanese War, North African Campaign of World War II, History of Prussia, Italian Unification Wars, Risorgimento, Albigensian Crusades, and much more. Click the link in the description or pinned comment to get the exclusive videos, early access to all public videos, our schedule, wallpapers, access to a special Discord server where we're very active, and much more. Thanks for supporting us, we couldn't be doing it without your help. The ancient world did not have racism as we perceive it today, as modern racism is built upon the advent of capitalism and European colonialism, and finding excuses to justify its brutality. However, ancient Greece did have societal prejudices, and there is some debate amongst scholars as to whether this part of Greek thought constituted racism, defined as prejudice based on biological racial features, or ethnic prejudice, defined as prejudice based on cultural traits. Some modern scholars believe that ancient Greek prejudices against the various peoples of the ancient Near East were non-hereditary, based not on race but on language and culture. Moreover, these modern scholars assert that racism as we know it today has its origins in the African slave trade of the European colonial era millennia later. When trying to understand the concept of identity in antiquity, it should be noted that our window into the ancient world's attitude towards race and ethnicity survives to us through written records and artwork that only the elite would have been able to afford, and therefore reflect the attitudes of the social elite and not the common people. Indeed, the average person likely did not share the beliefs of the elites, though prejudices definitely pervaded into commoner populations, much like today. With all this in mind, we will tackle the past's complexities as holistically as possible. Authors in antiquity held a variety of views of ethnicity and race, wildly diverging in space and time. However, one consistent trope that does emerge from ancient writing is a form of environmental determinism, or the notion that the climate sets up people's traits and behavior into stereotyped others. For instance, in the Archaic period, Hesiod's Theogony discusses monstrous races of people living on the corners of the known world, a pattern that has continued in later authors such as Herodotus and Ctesias, who describe bizarre races such as a breed of one-legged people with one massive foot living in India. Such stories show that the Greeks thought that extreme climates, different from their own, produced different kinds of people, to the extent of changing their physical image. These accounts are of course based on nothing more than tall tales, but the environmental determinism shines in Hesiod's pessimistic view of human society. His Theogony describes the 5 ages, with its own race of humans, called gold, silver, copper, heroic, and iron, being the current one. Much like the Yugas in Hinduism showing progressive degeneration of human quality of life, Hesiod sets out a view that human lives become worse over the generations, with the golden race under the Titan Kronos being eternally young, contrasting with the iron race, which had no connection to the gods. The 5 races are defined by their physical traits, which correspond to their virtue or behavior. He also, in his account of the flood of Deucalion, mentions how the Greeks are descended from the last of the copper race, Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha. This flood myth postulates that Zeus sent a flood that purged the copper race from the earth due to their destructive nature. As the only 2 survivors of this cataclysm, Deucalion and Pyrrha repopulated the earth in 2 ways. One was by throwing stones behind them that turned into humans, creating the other nations of the earth, while the other was them giving birth to Hellenes, who is considered the first ancestor of all the Greeks. Hellenes' children and grandchildren would bear names like Ion, Aelos or Achios, and were considered to be the progeny of the various sub-tribes of the Greeks, like the Ionians, Aeolians and Achaeans. The implication is that Greeks have a distinct racial background from other peoples, having come from Deucalion and not formed out of stones. The differences between different groups of humans were interpreted in various contrasting ways by a multitude of ancient authors. Aristotle believed that non-Greeks were, like enslaved peoples in Greece, inherently servile, and therefore deserved to be ruled by Greeks. Aristotle's most famous theory, the golden mean, or the idea that virtue is found between extreme values, is actually used to justify his Greco-supremacist way of thinking by way of the aforementioned theory of environmental determinism. In Aristotle's school of thought, people in hot climates, such as the Ethiopians, were too servile, while people in cold climates, such as the Northern Europeans, were too reckless. In contrast, the Greeks, who lived in moderate climates, were the ideal human beings, succumbing neither to sycophantic servility nor barbaric brutality, yielding to neither extreme. Hippocrates, one of Greece's most important physicians, was a major proponent of this theory and applied it to ethnic groups across the world. As Aristotle also shows other forms of prejudice, such as classism and sexism, this means that he considers these to be physical distinctions as well. As an example, he considers slaves to have inherent physical and mental differences from non-slaves, and that this supposedly justifies their enslavement. When applied to foreigners, this suggests to Aristotle that they are inherently servile and that Greeks should rule over them. This is an example of an influential ancient author essentializing prejudice against other peoples and even placing Greeks as racially superior people to them. In contrast to Aristotle, some other ancient Greek authors appeared far more tolerant of non-Greek peoples. An example of this is Herodotus, the father of history. In his works, Herodotus tries to explain why different non-Greek peoples look the way they do and behave the way they behave. However, his narration is relatively neutral and does not necessarily show any sort of prejudice towards these people groups. This is likely due to the fact that, unlike Aristotle, who lived in Greece and only saw foreigners as slaves and merchants, Herodotus actually travelled to many of the places he wrote about. As an example, his third book of the Histories is completely dedicated to Egypt, and he goes into depth as to why the northern and southern Egyptians look different, and what differences both groups have from the Greeks. However, there is no trace of prejudice in these passages, and Herodotus even shows some admiration for Egyptian knowledge. Similarly, Herodotus' account of the nomadic Scythians discusses some ethnic markers, such as tribes of people who were of partial Greek and Scythian descent having different traits from both. Like the Egyptians, Herodotus displays some admiration for the Scythians, whom he respected due to their opposition to Persian imperialism. Speaking of Persia, Herodotus portrays the Persians in a relatively nuanced way, despite being the historic enemies of Hellas. He does not depict them as inherently servile, acknowledging that they were living in a different, but not necessarily inferior way. Moreover, the Persian King of Kings, Darius the Great, is treated with remarkable respect in the text. The Greco-Persian Wars in Herodotus is an anti-imperialist struggle against foreigners who wish to conquer and control Greece, not a struggle of civilizations, or between a civilized West and a barbaric East, as many claim today. Having discussed some authors and their views, we will now move on to social attitudes and laws towards non-Greeks by Greeks. This is an inherently difficult endeavor, as the ancient Greek world underwent many changes over the centuries, from the Mycenaean to the Hellenistic period and beyond, while the Greeks themselves colonized regions as far apart as Iberia and Pakistan. This naturally leads to a lot of diversity across time and space when it comes to the ancient Greeks' relationship with and perception of the non-Greek peoples around them. Ancient Athens is an interesting example of ancient notions of ethnicity and race due to its claim to autochthony, or being born from the earth. Many Greek polis had myths of founders who migrated from elsewhere, like Heracles being a progenitor of the Macedonians. Athenians usually saw themselves as having been literally born from the earth, as descendants of the snake man Erechtheus. As democracy expanded in Athens, questions of ethnicity propelled what Jonathan Hall has called racialized citizenship. This led the Athenians to consider themselves an ethnic group that was separate from others in order to have a limit to their community's franchise. Solon, the archaic period lawgiver, who shifted Athens from an aristocracy to an oligarchy, initiated reforms that freed Athenians from servitude by forgiving their debts to their masters, and in a sense ensured that slaves in Athens would almost exclusively have non-Athenian origins, as the Athenians who became slaves were freed and their ranks were filled with non-Athenians. The ethnic makeup of Athenian citizenry later shifted with two major expansions of the franchise of various essential workers, like the rowers of the Athenian fleet during the late Peloponnesian War due to their service in fighting Sparta and the political leverage their military performance provided. This was decried by some Athenian politicians, like Demosthenes, who claimed Athens was becoming impure because of the newly enfranchised population not being autochthonous. Thus, we can see that parts of the Athenian population harbour ethnically prejudiced beliefs. However, we must also acknowledge that there were other class motives at play. For instance, a major element of Athenian racial citizenship was the limitation of citizenship laws by Pericles, from only needing paternal descent to requiring both an Athenian mother and father in order to qualify for citizenship. Athenian men of wealthy means often took foreign wives, and this gave them more wealth and status. It is thus possible that this law was more about constricting this possibility and being a populist measure against the elites. All Greek polis had their own such institutions to regulate citizenship, and this was often linked to the ability to go to places like gymnasia or participate in the agora. These restrictive enfranchisement policies were criticized by the philosopher Zeno of Citium, who claimed that the ideal polis had no gymnasia or courts. In his ideal Hellenic society, everyone participated in free love, no temples of gods existed as people were virtuous and pious everywhere, and everyone wore the same clothes to eliminate the distinctions between foreigner and native, and male and female. This is an early anarchist philosophy, a likely critique of Plato's Republic, which describes a class-based society ruled by philosopher kings, and a critique of Athenian citizenship laws. Institutions of citizenship took an intriguing role when the Hellenistic Age began, as Hellenic cities were built in Hellenistic kingdoms based on Greek citizenship notions and for Greek settlers. For instance, in Babylon, the Seleucids invested in and built new structures like gymnasia for use by citizens, who were mostly Greeks, thus separating them from other Babylonian denizens. The notion of citizenship was apparently introduced during this period, and, at least initially, was restricted to Greeks. In the case of Babylon, another community organization existed for the local Babylonians, and conflict is attested on occasion between these communities, like after the death of Antiochus IV. These institutions were present across the Hellenistic world. Hellenism was often promoted in these kingdoms, which meant Greek language, cultures, and people were favored on occasion. But like the case of Babylon, we also see cases where ethnic prejudices also affected cities and relations between ancient people. Ethnicity was thus a category that played a role in Hellenistic politics and separated or merged people together based on political necessity. So, were there specific stereotypes about ethnic groups in ancient Greece, and did these result in general prejudice amongst the Greeks? Benjamin Isaac notes how, in Homer's Odyssey of all places, the Phoenicians are depicted as being great at crafts, trade, and naval conduct. While this can be seen as a form of positive prejudice, the Phoenicians' skill at commerce and seafaring is ultimately associated with their inherent tendency to be scheming and treacherous. This attitude towards the Phoenicians was common among the Greeks, as the Phoenicians were their primary rival when it came to the colonization of the Mediterranean. Ptolemy of Alexandria took the anti-Phoenician rhetoric even further, as he tried to prove astronomically that everyone to the east of Egypt was prone to duplicity. With that said, anti-Phoenician sentiment could not have been unanimously popular among the Greeks, for Greek culture absorbed many Phoenician elements over the centuries, with the goddess Aphrodite even theorized to have originally been the Phoenician goddess Ishtar. Some Greek myths also seem to acknowledge a notion of ex oriente lux, or out of the east light, in myths like Europa, the princess kidnapped by Zeus in the form of a bull and mother of King Minos of Crete hailing from Phoenicia. When it came to the Egyptians, many Greek commentators such as Plato, Solon, and the aforementioned Herodotus admired them for their wisdom. However, like the Phoenicians, they were often also depicted as deceivers and tricksters. In fact, Plutarch, a Greek from Chaeronea, explicitly attacks Herodotus for his admiration of the Egyptians, as he considers them to be fools for worshipping animal-headed gods. The Jewish people fared worse in Hellenic eyes and were subject to violent pogroms by the pagan Greeks, such as a massacre in Alexandria in 68 CE, with Roman governors fanning the flames. These stereotypes often included early anti-Semitic tropes, or attacks on Jewish practices like the Shabbat. Even other Greek-speaking peoples did not escape Greek stereotyping. The Macedonians, for example, were not considered proper Greeks because of their contact with the Thracians, Scythians and Illyrians, peoples considered martial and bizarre by many of the Greek polis. These divisions show that a lot of these attitudes were prevalent amongst authors, and likely were used as a form of manufacturing consent for prejudice by others, like the aforementioned Demosthenes critiquing the enfranchisement of enslaved peoples into the Athenian demos. However, as we have seen, these prejudices did not stop the Greeks from mingling and hybridizing with the various non-Greek or semi-Greek cultures they came into contact with. For elites in the Hellenistic world, these lines were blurry, such as in the Greco-Bactrian city of Ai-Khanum in Afghanistan, where the elites created a clearly Hellenistic founder's shrine and after a soldier called Cineas, as well as a gymnasium. The same elites, however, also patronized Iranian architecture, like a temenos in the elite quarter of the city, and also funded a shrine that practiced Iranian religious rites. This was a case of Hellenistic and Achaemenid elite cultures uniting to make themselves different from the local or lower classes. In the Indo-Greek kingdom, the local king Menander I, or Melinda, famously converted to Buddhism according to the traditional narrative, but also sponsored the Greek goddess Athena through his coinage. Alexander the Great's agenda for ruling Persia shows contradictions, as he wanted Persians to have a proper Greek education, while also adopting local Persian royal customs. This careful balancing act was also met with resistance by his Hellenic compatriots. These are just some of many examples of the cross-pollination of Greek culture with local cultures when Greeks colonized a region. All of these show us that there are many examples of both institutional segregation and an active mixture of peoples in the Hellenistic world. In conclusion, the attitudes that the ancient Greeks held towards non-Greek peoples were highly varied and capable of being both positive and negative. Some ancient Greek beliefs about their cultural neighbours were clear prejudices, though there were variations as to whether these were based on hereditary racial superiority or non-hereditary cultural prejudices. These beliefs and practices had varying legal and philosophical receptions, from Herodotus's general interest and acceptance to Aristotle's essentializing prejudice, and from Athens's citizenship laws to the cultural fluidity of the Hellenistic cities in places like Egypt and Central Asia. Understanding these ancient attitudes is important for us to develop a more intimate knowledge of how society worked in the past, and how their cultural biases could be wielded for political gain or ignored in favor of tolerance. It is social structures that create prejudice or tolerance, so looking at the past can help us understand our own societies and how to make them better. More videos on this topic are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.